The Wehrmacht was not a superhuman army. It was a collapsing machine held together by fear, myth, and hindsight. That is where our story begins. Not with glory, not with iron discipline, but with the shuddering crack in a legend the world has repeated for 80 years. Imagine the scene. German soldiers retreating through mud, faces hollow. Officers burning documents as the Eastern Front collapses. Casualty charts rising like gravestones. These are not images of a perfect war machine. They are the anatomy of a myth dying in real time. And yet, in comment sections, documentaries, forums, and late-night debates, the myth persists. German soldiers were the best in the world. But that belief cracks under pressure the moment we measure it against anything real. Discipline, logistics, training standards, casualty outcomes. Every metric that matters tells the opposite story. The world remembers the aesthetic of the Wehrmacht, crisp uniforms, sharp maneuvers, the seductive imagery of efficiency. But aesthetics are not performance. Myth is not reality. And sometimes the legend is born not from strength, but from the ruins of defeat. The question is here. If the Wehrmacht truly had the best soldiers in the world, then why did they lose strategically, logistically, morally, and absolutely? In this video, we peel back the legend layer by layer until only the unvarnished truth remains.
The myth of the superhuman German soldier did not begin on the battlefield. It began after the battlefield, when Europe lay in ruins, the Cold War was forming, and the world desperately needed a story simple enough to digest, a narrative clean enough to explain the chaos. In 1945, the Wehrmacht was not revered. It was shattered. Millions dead, millions captured, divisions hollowed out to skeletons. Yet in the years that followed, a strange alchemy took place. A defeated army was reframed as a near-perfect fighting force. How did this happen? The answer lies in three converging forces: political convenience, selective memory, and the seductive power of aesthetic warfare. The first force, the West, needed a new enemy. As the Cold War dawned, the Soviets, not the Germans, became the primary threat. Western governments found it useful to portray the Wehrmacht not as brutal invaders, but as honorable soldiers who had merely been led astray by Hitler. It was geopolitical sanitation. The second force, German generals rewrote their own story. Memoirs published in the 1950s painted themselves as military geniuses burdened by an incompetent dictator. Their failures in logistics, planning, and morale evaporated from the pages. What remained was a curated portrait: cold, efficient, unstoppable. The third force, the aesthetics of the Wehrmacht. Crisp uniforms, fast maneuvers, iconic footage of blitzkrieg tanks racing across Europe. The imagery was seductive, cinematic. It looked like perfection, even when the reality behind it was rust, breakdowns, and improvised chaos. Over time, these forces fused into a single narrative that the Wehrmacht lost not because it was flawed, but because it was overwhelmed by numbers, or by weather, or by the mistakes of others. A myth needs excuses, and this one collected them greedily. But when we strip away the post-war narratives, what remains is something far more human and far less flattering. An army ravaged by attrition, a command structure divided by ego, logistics that collapsed long before the final battles, training pipelines stretched to breaking, morale eroding like wet paper. This is where the real investigation begins. Not with legends, but with evidence. Not with myth, but with the raw mechanics of an army under strain.
The myth begins with an image carved into global memory. The Wehrmacht marching in perfect rows,
helmets aligned, boots striking the earth like a single mechanical heart. But discipline is not how soldiers walk, it's how they break. And by 1944, the German army was breaking everywhere. With over 1 million soldiers deserting, wounded, or simply disappearing into forests and villages, the so-called iron discipline was already rusting from the inside. The machine was collapsing, and no parade ground perfection could hide it. True discipline comes from cohesion, purpose, and belief. But by the last 2 years of the war, the Wehrmacht had lost all three. What held many units together was not loyalty, but fear. Fear of Gestapo patrols, fear of execution squads, fear of being labeled a traitor. Entire companies retreated without orders, some refusing to advance even when threatened. The myth claims unwavering resolve. The reality shows men trapped between two deaths, one from the Allies and one from their own regime. By 1944-45, German morale hit levels unseen in earlier wars. Letters recovered from the front show soldiers exhausted, disillusioned, and openly admitting they no longer believed in victory. Commanders wrote frantic reports about units refusing combat or surrendering en masse. If the Wehrmacht was the best-trained, most disciplined army, why did its foundations rot so quickly? The myth doesn't answer this, history does. Another pillar of the legend claims German training was unmatched. In the early years, this held some truth. Instructors were veterans, exercises were rigorous, and professionalism was high. But as losses skyrocketed, the system collapsed. By 1944, new recruits received barely 6 weeks of training, many learning to fire a rifle only once before being sent to the front. Elite doctrine cannot survive when the pipeline itself is dying. The once feared German infantry became a patchwork of boys, elderly men, and barely trained conscripts. The Volkssturm, often romanticized as fanatical defenders, was in reality a desperate levy of teenagers and 60-year-olds, given rifles they barely knew how to operate. These were not elite warriors. They were the final, painful proof that Germany had run out of soldiers long before it ran out of myths. The third myth paints German command as tactically superior, masters of military science, but what many call brilliance was often desperate improvisation. Blitzkrieg itself wasn't a perfectly crafted doctrine, it was a gamble born from necessity, exploiting short windows before logistics collapsed. When fuel shortages hit and Allied air power dominated, the so-called genius evaporated. Real strategy must endure pressure. Improvisation crumbles under it. The Wehrmacht did neither. Captured documents reveal a darker truth. German command was fracturing. Hitler issued contradictory orders, generals competed for influence, and units frequently acted without coordination. This wasn't a well-oiled machine. It was a machine tearing itself apart. Tactical excellence cannot survive when strategic leadership is a battlefield of egos. When we compare actual combat outcomes, the narrative collapses. German units surrendered in larger numbers than Allied ones. Their casualty ratios worsened every year. Their strategic decisions repeatedly backfired. This is not the profile of a superhuman army. It is the profile of an overstretched, exhausted force fighting for a regime that no longer even believed its own promises. The doctrine of German superiority was never about historical truth. It was about post-war storytelling. It allowed former Nazis to frame their defeat as heroic, Western militaries to romanticize a worthy opponent, and modern audiences to cling to a simple narrative. But myths do not honor the past, they bury it. And the truth, once uncovered, tells a far more human story, not of supermen, but of exhausted men pushed beyond the limits of discipline, training, and command.
If the human element of the Wehrmacht was fracturing under pressure, the steel skeleton that supported it was already broken. This brings us to the fourth fracture in the legend, the myth of superior technology. Pop culture has obsessed over the big cats, the Tiger and Panther tanks. In video games and movies, these are portrayed as invincible juggernauts,
apex predators that could destroy 5 Allied tanks for every one they lost. The aesthetic is undeniable. Thick armor, massive high-velocity guns, and an imposing silhouette that struck terror into Allied crews. But a war is not won by specifications on a blueprint. It is won by reliability in the mud. And here, the German engineering myth collapses under its own weight. The Tiger and Panther were technological nightmares. They were over-engineered, overly complex, and catastrophically unreliable. For every Tiger destroyed by an Allied shell, countless others were abandoned by their own crews because a transmission failed, an engine overheated, or they simply ran out of fuel. The Panther, often hailed as the best tank of the war, had a final drive that would notoriously shatter after just 150 kilometers of travel. A tank that cannot move is not a weapon. It is a steel coffin. While the Allies built Shermans and T-34s that were good enough and could be repaired in a muddy field with a wrench, the Wehrmacht built delicate instruments that required specialized tools and factory-level maintenance just to keep running. Furthermore, the image of a fully mechanized German army is a lie. For every panzer division racing forward in propaganda reels, there were infantry divisions lagging behind, reliant on horses. The Wehrmacht was not a futuristic army of steel. It was a Napoleonic army with a thin veneer of modernization. Logistics is the boring science that destroys exciting myths. By 1944, the German war machine was starving. The lack of fuel meant that elite pilots couldn't train, and panzer divisions had to abandon their vehicles intact. The superiority of German armor becomes irrelevant when the tanks are turned into static pillboxes because the fuel trucks were bombed 300 miles away. This leads us to the final, and perhaps most pervasive myth, the idea that the German soldier fought to the bitter end out of unshakable loyalty to Hitler and the fatherland. The narrative suggests a kind of dark knightly valor, a spiritual refusal to surrender. The reality was far more cynical. By the final year of the war, the primary motivator for the average Wehrmacht soldier was not love for the leader, but fear, terror. Not just fear of the enemy, but fear of their own side. The Nazi regime held its own army hostage. As the fronts collapsed, the machinery of internal repression went into overdrive. The Feldgendarmerie, the military police, known by the soldiers as Kettenhunde, or chained dogs, roamed the rear areas. Their orders were simple: execute deserters immediately. Soldiers retreating from the slaughter of the Eastern Front weren't met with sympathy. They were met with flying court-martials that hung men from lampposts and trees with signs around their necks reading, "I am a traitor." This was not discipline. It was a death cult consuming its own members. Furthermore, on the Eastern Front, there was the terrifying calculus of surrender. German soldiers knew the atrocities their army had committed in Russia. They knew that Soviet captivity likely meant death in a gulag. They fought desperately not to win, but to delay the inevitable, to buy time to flee west and surrender to the Americans or British. This wasn't the super soldier spirit. It was the survival instinct of men trapped in a burning building with no exits. They were squeezed between the vengeance of the Red Army and the execution squads of the SS. To label this coercion as heroic loyalty is to insult the reality of their suffering. It sanitizes the brutality of the Nazi regime against its own people. The Wehrmacht didn't hold the line in 1945 because they believed in victory. They held the line because the alternative was a bullet in the back of the head. So when we look at the panzer divisions of 1944 and 1945, what do we actually see? We don't see a futuristic force of invincible warriors. We see a logistical corpse. We see high-tech tanks abandoned for lack of gas. We see teenage conscripts wearing uniforms that don't fit, holding rifles they can't aim, shivering in trenches without winter gear. We see officers looking over their shoulders for the military police. The machine was not efficient. It was broken. The soldiers were not supermen. They were victims and perpetrators trapped in a spiral of destruction. The myth says they were an army of iron will. The evidence says they were an army of rust and fear. And when this hollow shell finally cracked, the collapse wasn't just military, it was total.
By January 1945, the theoretical debates about tactics and technology ceased to matter. The timeline had run out. This brings us to the moment where the myth of the super soldier didn't just crack, it shattered completely. This is the collapse. In the popular imagination, the end of the Wehrmacht is often portrayed as a tragic Wagnerian opera. Elite units fighting heroically to the last man against overwhelming hordes. But look closer at the footage from the Vistula, from the Oder, from the Ruhr pocket. You do not see a disciplined machine conducting a fighting withdrawal. You see a stampede. The reality of 1945 was a logistical apocalypse. The vaunted German order had dissolved into anarchy. Entire armies evaporated overnight, not because they were all killed, but because the chain of command had simply ceased to exist. General headquarters were losing contact with their divisions for days at a time. Divisions lost contact with their regiments, and at the bottom of this broken ladder was the individual soldier, starving, freezing, and realizing that the genius leadership in Berlin had abandoned him. The illusion of the motorized Wehrmacht was stripped away entirely. On the roads retreating west, there were no columns of Tiger tanks. There were miles of horse-drawn carts, stolen civilian bicycles, and desperate men clinging to the sides of coal trucks. It was a medieval army dying in the industrial age. The fuel crisis was so absolute that pilots were ordered to drain the tanks of parked aircraft just to get one messenger vehicle moving. Tanks that cost millions of Reichsmarks to build were shoved into ditches by their own crews because they had become nothing more than 60-ton roadblocks. And where was the superhuman discipline? It was rotting in the fields. In the final months, the cohesion of the Wehrmacht disintegrated. We saw units turning their guns on their own officers. We saw officers stripping off their rank insignia and fleeing in civilian clothes, leaving their teenage conscripts to face the Soviet steamroller alone. The propaganda newsreels, Die Deutsche Wochenschau, kept playing footage of smiling, confident soldiers until the very last week. But the soldiers knew the truth. They nicknamed these broadcasts the fairy tales. The disconnect between the myth of victory and the reality of annihilation broke the soldier's mind before the enemy even fired a shot. Consider the Ruhr pocket in April 1945. Here was Army Group B, over 300,000 soldiers, the core of the remaining German strength in the West. According to the myth, these men should have fought to the death, turning every factory into a fortress. Instead, they surrendered en masse. 300,000 men laid down their weapons in days. It was one of the largest capitulations in history. Why? Because the warrior spirit was a lie constructed by propaganda. When the food stopped coming and the ammunition ran dry, the ideology evaporated. They weren't supermen. They were exhausted human beings who just wanted the nightmare to end. And what replaced them? The final, tragic proof of the Wehrmacht's failure. The Volkssturm. The myth of the professional army ended with images of 12-year-old boys in oversized helmets trying to carry Panzerfausts
they could barely lift. There is no glory in this. There is no military genius in sending a grandfather and his grandson to die in a trench to defend a bunker that the generals had already evacuated. The site of the Volkssturm is the ultimate debunking of the Wehrmacht legend. A superior army protects its people. The Wehrmacht, in its final throes, consumed its people. By May 1945, the illusion was stripped bare. The pristine columns of marching soldiers from 1939 were gone. In their place were mountains of abandoned equipment, burning cities, and millions of prisoners staring blankly through barbed wire. The Wehrmacht didn't end with a bang of heroic defiance. It ended with a whimper of total systemic failure. The best army in the world hadn't just lost a war. It had proven that its entire foundation, from logistics to leadership to morality, was fatally flawed from the very beginning. The myth says they were overwhelmed by numbers. The reality is they collapsed under the weight of their own incompetence and arrogance.
So if the Wehrmacht was logistically broken, strategically flawed, and morally bankrupt, why does the myth of the super soldier survive today? The answer is the final twist in our story. History is usually written by the victors. But in this case, the history of the Wehrmacht was rewritten by the losers, with the victors' permission. In the 1950s, the Cold War began. The West needed a rearmed West Germany to stand against the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the narrative changed. The Allies couldn't sell the public on an alliance with Nazi monsters, so a new story was crafted, the clean Wehrmacht. German generals like Manstein and Guderian wrote best-selling memoirs. In these books, they blamed every defeat on Hitler's interference and claimed every victory for their own genius. They painted the Wehrmacht as an honorable, professional machine that was simply overwhelmed by Russian hordes and American industry. The West accepted this lie because it was politically convenient. Hollywood adopted it because it was cinematic. Video games adopted it because supervillains are fun to fight. And so the Wehrmacht was scrubbed clean of its rust and its crimes, polished into the shiny, invincible idol we see on social media today. But when we peel back that polish, we find 3 blood lessons that every student of history and every modern leader must understand. Lesson 1. Aesthetics do not equal competence. The Wehrmacht had the best uniforms. They had the most aggressive-looking tanks. They had the coolest marching songs. But war is not a fashion show. The unglamorous reality of logistics, trucks, fuel, spare parts, boots, is what wins wars. We must stop confusing looking dangerous with being dangerous. A jagged knife kills just as well as a polished sword, especially if the sword is stuck in the scabbard because of a broken spring. Lesson 2. Fear is a toxic fuel. A system built on fear can achieve short-term bursts of intensity, but it has no endurance. The Wehrmacht fought hard because they were terrified of their own government, but when the structure cracked, they didn't just retreat, they dissolved. True resilience comes from trust, not terror. You cannot build a super army on the foundation of a police state. Lesson 3. The danger of the myth. Why does debunking this matter? Because respecting the Wehrmacht as supermen insults the reality of the war. It insults the Allied soldiers who defeated them, not just with numbers, but with better strategy, better logistics, and better adaptability. And paradoxically, it insults the German soldiers themselves. It turns their tragic, human suffering into a cartoon.
They weren't robots. They were men led into the abyss by a regime that viewed them as disposable ammunition. The Wehrmacht was a formidable enemy, yes, but they were a flawed, breaking machine from day one. They didn't lose because of bad luck. They lost because they built a military based on short-term gambles and unsustainable arrogance. We study them not to worship their image, but to learn from their catastrophic failure. Because if we only remember the legend, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes that created it. Now, I want to turn this over to you. In the comments below, I want you to answer a tough question. Why do you think modern media is still so obsessed with the German super soldier? Is it just the cool uniforms, or is it something deeper in our psychology that admires authoritarian power? Be honest. Let's start a real debate. If this video changed your perspective on WW2, hit that like button. It helps us fight the algorithm and bring real history to more people. Subscribe to Eastern Front Declassified and turn on the bell. Next week, we're going to investigate the Red Army. Were they really just a mindless horde, or were they the true tactical innovators of the war? You won't want to miss that. And remember, the truth is always more interesting than the myth.